Another Friday. We've been granted another Friday. Happy Friday. I'm Cheryl Fidelman, the Conscious Codependence Coach. And today's topic on Fridays with Fidelman is codependence isn't listening. In any moment that we are in a codependent moment, we're operating from codependence, we're demonstrating some codependent habit or behavior, we are not listening. Codependence takes over, listening shuts down. Codependence is not listening. As soon as we're in a codependent moment, all of these filters come into play, bending and interpreting what we're hearing, and also bending and interpreting, throwing in filters through which we listen to our own inner voice, our own sensations, our own emotions, and our own thoughts. So codependence isn't listening to others, and codependence isn't listening to us. So more on that in this video, and also I got a few announcements here for the Conscious Codependence community coming up in the next few weeks. So thanks so much for listening. And okay, here we go. In any given codependent moment, and the way that I identify that is any moment that we are coming from one or more of the three tenets of conscious codependence. So when we're listening from a place of the want to be wanted, the need to be needed, or the need to prove ourselves, we are not listening to what the person is actually saying. And by listening, I mean adding and subtracting nothing. That's what I mean by listening. I mean actually adding and subtracting nothing. So in other words, you may be talking to me, and I may have a thought about what you're saying or an interpretation about what you're saying. And so I'm, instead of believing the interpretation and then responding to you based on the belief in my interpretation, then by listening and adding and subtracting nothing, like adding no interpretation to what you're saying, I actually notice what's going on inside me. And then I may have a question, right? Like, is this what you meant by that? I noticed by adding and subtracting nothing, you may not want to literally say that, but you certainly can. I noticed by adding and subtracting nothing to myself, I had an interpretation. So I'm going to see if that interpretation is accurate. Or when we're actually listening and noticing our inner world, our sensations and emotions, we may notice we're afraid while we're listening. And as opposed to acting or reacting from that fear, we may then be curious about our own experience before we react. And so a huge part of my conscious codependence recovery training is training people to listen to their inner voice. And our inner voice, and I don't just mean our intuition. I'm training you to listen to your interpretations. I'm training you to listen to the filters through which you're bending what other people are saying. And the more we notice our filters, the more we then can actually hear what our intuition is saying. We actually can feel true and real connection when we notice all of these filters, when we can hear all of these filters, and then actually get down to the true essence of us and to the true essence of what another person is saying. And a very common experience for a lot of us codependents, and not just for codependents, for lots of different people who identify as different things, but for these purposes, for those that identify as codependent or simply have some codependent habits or behaviors that they're working through while watching my videos and moving through some of my programs, our experience often is you're not listening, right? We think that people are not listening because we don't feel heard. And so we may point to the person and go, you're not listening, but ultimately the experience that we're having over here with us is, I'm not being heard. So the more we can lean into and notice our own experience, the more we can lean into curiosity. And I say that a million trillion times, right? The more we can lean into our own experience, the more we can lean into curiosity with another person. Because sometimes when we're not feeling heard, the other person might have had a different interpretation of what we said. So it may look like something like, oh, I notice I'm not being heard. If I go into curiosity, I may want to ask the person, what did you hear me say? Because it seems like maybe I said something different than what you're hearing. Let me just check in. When our filters go up of fear, protection, and defense, then we are actually putting disconnection in the space. The way we can connect is reconnect to self. I'm noticing I'm not being heard. Then connect to another person. What did you hear? So we're bridging the gap. And oftentimes in codependence, we see gaps that are not bridgeable. We think they're not bridgeable. And when we work on our listening, we can bridge any gap, most importantly, the gap in our relationship with ourselves. We often feel a gap between us and another person in our codependent moments because codependence is not listening. It's not listening to us. It's not listening to our interpretations, our thoughts. It's believing our thoughts, which is not the same as listening to them. So listening means adding and subtracting nothing. Listening might even mean you're not even adding truth to what your interpretation is. You're noticing the interpretation, and then you may notice what that interpretation is doing to you. Is it making you scared? Is it making you separate? Is it projecting onto the other person something that you think they're doing? So noticing and bearing witness to ourself and our experience, adding and subtracting nothing, and then checking in with another person's experience, adding and subtracting nothing. That is listening. That is bearing witness to purely the phenomenon that's happening within another person. Because the thing is, codependence often breeds codependence. So if I'm talking to you from the need to prove myself, then that may trigger some need to prove yourself. Or if I all of a sudden move into protection and defense, you may also move into protection and defense. And we move away from the possibility that we're actually mirroring each other. It occurs as disconnection, but oftentimes we are actually mirroring the energetics of each other. Another way of saying this is codependence isn't listening, it's projecting. Codependence isn't listening, it's interpreting. Codependence isn't listening, it's protecting, it's defending. Codependence isn't listening to our intuition. Codependence is confusing our intuition with the interpretation of our traumatic identity, which is often protect, defend, this person is doing something to me. Codependence is listening to our default, and believing our default, which may be something like you're not valued, you're not worthy, you should not talk, you don't have the right to talk. So codependence is listening to is mainly listening to our inner punisher and our traumatic identity and what our unhealed trauma is telling us. That's what codependence is listening to. It is not listening to our heart, our intuition, and our ability and right to be curious about self and others. So oftentimes codependence is listening to our memory of the past and our fantasy about the future and shutting us down in the present. And oftentimes a lot of us codependents, we won't speak up because we're holding a list on you. We're holding some past-based situations where we didn't feel heard by you. So we go, you know what, you're not going to hear me anyway, so we don't even speak. And so we validate and give ourselves, our codependence gives ourselves our own repression in a given moment because we're projecting and future tripping and past tripping. In the past, you didn't hear me, so in the future, you're not going to hear me. So in the present moment, I'm just going to shut down. Now, here's a huge gift of listening, of bearing witness. When we can get the high tones, the low tones, the emotional state, the words, the intention, the mood, the entire picture and scene around the message that somebody is giving us and the experience that they are trying to demonstrate to us that they're having, and we can get the whole thing, that is incredibly connecting. More often than not, we cannot get the whole picture of what somebody is experiencing when we can't get the whole picture of what we are experiencing in a current moment. Here's another little piece. There's so many pieces to this, but I don't want to make this like a 3-hour video, but come take the workshop. This will all be in there and more. That when we have an overactive cognition, and even for some of us when we're alone, it doesn't even have to do with people in front of us, right? When we're alone, we're thinking, we're past tripping, we're future tripping, we're thinking about our bodies, we're thinking about what we did do or what we didn't do, or some fight we had with somebody else 5 years ago, right? We have an overactive cognition, and everything that's going on in there has nothing to do with the actual visceral experience of the present moment. The more we are listening to the hamster wheel of our cognition, the less we can hear our soul. The less we can hear some people call them downloads from spirit or from the universe. Some people say it's their own soul actually speaking to them. We can call it your heart. The more you are listening to and believing your overactive cognition, the less you have the space and availability to hear and listen to your own heart and your own creativity and your own inner truth. So I am launching the 12th The Listening Workshop. It's called The Listening Workshop, and this will be number 12. And it's an 8-week group program where we go over my 7 distinctions around listening. We go over listening through the filter of relating, listening through the filter of agreeing, right? We're listening while we're agreeing when we don't even actually agree. And there's a lot of nervous system healing where I train you in noticing at what's being said and felt within you if you're listening to an interpretation of your inner punisher and your traumatic identity versus listening to your actual intuition. So in the listening workshop, we go over listening to the many layers of your inner world, listening to other people, and then listening and noticing the interpretations and projections of other people. So all of those layers we go over in the 8-week program. There's a link down below if you want to schedule your Decode Your Codependence session with me. We'll do some deep work in that session, and you'll get a sense of the listening workshop to see if that's something that you want to jump into in a couple months if it feels like a fit. Either way, the Decode Your Codependence session will make a huge difference for you, I promise. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And my suggestion for this week is to practice the third tenet of conscious codependence. Or practice not doing the third tenet of conscious codependence, which is the need to prove oneself. Notice if you're listening through a filter of proving. Just notice. Notice if that comes up. The bonus would be not to prove anything, but just simply notice if you're listening through a filter of proving. And then if you can try the bonus homework assignment, which is not to prove anything, which is a practice. It's a practice. You don't have to get it, certainly by far don't have to get it perfect. It's just a practice. A couple of announcements. The free and monthly conscious codependence classes are moving from the 4th Wednesday to the month to the 3rd Wednesday of the month. So the next one is June 21st at 3 p.m. PST. You will get an email about that. Keep your eyes peeled for the 6th Conscious Codependence series, Soul versus Trauma. I've interviewed 10 amazing experts in, time management, connecting more to spirit, connecting more to intuition, ultimately living life beyond the point of view of your trauma to living life from the point of view of your soul. That is the 6th Conscious Codependence series, Soul vs. Trauma. You'll be getting that in your inbox real soon. And come join us in cohort 12 of the Conscious Codependence Listening Workshop. Thank you so much for listening to my thoughts, theories, and rants. Happy Friday. Have a wonderful weekend. Happy healing. And life is now.